Hi, everyone. So today we are going to be starting a new unit or new topic of ecology. So this is the study of how organisms interact with other organisms. So how one population interacts with another population or one species interacts with another species, as well as how different species and different populations interact with the environment that they live in. So some of the questions we are going to be trying to answer over the course of this unit are, how do organisms affect their environment? So for example, as humans, we create a lot of pollution, which has affected the environment of the planet. Number two is, how does the environment affect population? So the other way around, and this is getting into, again, evolution via natural selection. So when the environment changes, how does that change a population? And number three, how do different species interact? So there's different types of relationships between different species or different populations, and some are helpful, some are hurtful, some are neutral. We're going to be looking at that. Before we can get into those questions, though, we have to go over something called taxonomy. And so taxonomy is the study of naming or classifying organisms. So when we give a scientific name to an organism, it is actually a Latin word. So we use the Latin language to name different organisms and different species. And we use a system called binomial nomenclature. So bi means two, so it is a two-name naming system. And so it's broken down into a genus name and a species name. And you'll see the binomial nomenclature written in italics, so like Homo sapiens, Canis familiaris, Felis domesticus. They're in italics to represent binomial nomenclature. And then as far as genus goes, genus is the first part of the name. So we can have a genus for Homo, genus for Canis, genus for Felis. And then the species is the second part of the name, or the second word. So here the species would be sapiens, or species would be familiaris, or species would be domesticus. And basically, by using binomial nomenclature, we're able to name all of the different organisms on this planet and have a logical, organized system of naming. So again, binomial nomenclature is our naming system. We have a broad category in the genus and a more specific name in the species. So for example, these four organisms are all types of cats. However, they are different types of cats. So they're all going to have the same genus name. They're all under Felis to show that they are part of the cat family. However, their species is different. So Felis domesticus is your house cat. We can have Felis nigripes. I'm not sure how to say it. And this is your wild African black-footed cat. So it looks cute, but it's dangerous. You can have Felis chaus, which is the Asian jungle cat. So again, it looks cute, but definitely dangerous. And then Felis concolor, which is your mountain lion, definitely dangerous. All of them are a type of cat, but each one has a specific species name. So this whole binomial nomenclature originated from the need of it. Back in the day, again, we're still using the Latin language, but back in the day, biologists would classify and name organisms using descriptive names. So, for example, the honeybee was known as all of this. I can try to read it. It's not going to come out pretty. So the honeybee, instead of calling it a honeybee, its scientific name used to be Apis pubescens thores subgrecio abdomine fusco pedibus postices glabus untrinque margine silatus. Sounded like some sort of witchcraft spell. But that would be like the name for the honeybee. So finally, in 1750, this Swedish biologist came along, Carl Linnaeus, and he was like, that's ridiculous. We're going to come up with a different naming system. And so he came up with binomial nomenclature. So within binomial nomenclature, Linnaeus also was able to classify organisms. It was based off of morphology, which is physical structures. But he came up with like a very logical and streamlined way of classifying organisms. So we have our broadest category of classification at the top over here, and our most specific category of classification at the bottom down here. So usually we can use the genus and species name of an organism to describe what it is. But in reality, it's going to have these 7 different classification names. So you can have a domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And each one gets, like I said, more specific as you work your way down. So we are actually going to be going into detail about the 5 different kingdoms that exist. Or is it 6? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, there's 6 kingdoms. So we're going to be going through the 6 different kingdoms and the specific characteristics of each kingdom. Before we do that, for this classification system, we can put it into like a diagram or a chart form. And this first type of diagram is called cladistics or a cladogram. And so basically this is showing the shared characteristics of different organisms to determine their evolutionary relationship. So what this is showing you is, for example, the chimp and the mouse connect right here. They are closely connected, so they are more related to each other than like the chimp and the hagfish over here. This is also showing you a timeline in a way. So we can follow this timeline right here. And then it's showing you all these different spots where a new characteristic evolved and how that changed the organisms moving forward, as well as the organisms that might have already evolved. So for example, the difference between a perch fish and a hagfish, and then the salamander and lizard, is the development of lungs. And so that's what this is telling you over here. Now we can take our cladogram one step further and make it more broad. We call that a phylogenetic tree. It's basically like the tree of life. So again, it's showing those evolutionary relationships between different types of organisms. So again, this up here would be like the origin of life, the very first living organism. And then we have bacteria probably came first, archaea bacteria, protocysts, and then we get the formation of eukaryotes. So now we have cell organelles. And so you can look through this chart here, and sort of look at the different relationships between organisms. So basically, what this is showing you is that mammals and crocodiles and birds, for example, are more closely related to each other than crustaceans over here. All right, so like I said, there should be 6 kingdoms that we are talking about. I don't know why it has 5, but there should be 6 kingdoms, and we're going to be going through all the different characteristics of each kingdom. All right, so first one up is archaea bacteria. So we are talking about prokaryotes, we're talking about bacteria, but archaea means old. So these are really old bacteria. They probably are like the first type of organism that we saw on this planet. So their main defining feature, their defining characteristic, is that they tend to live in extreme environments. So this could be extremely hot, extremely cold, extremely salty, extremely acidic, or a combination of those. Basically, they live in places that no other organism can live, survive, or thrive, and they love it. So I'll get to examples of them over here in a second, but what you need to know is that archaea bacteria are all prokaryotic, so they don't have cell organelles. They can be a heterotroph or an autotroph, so sometimes they need to eat food to survive, sometimes they can make their own food in a process similar to photosynthesis, except they don't use the same reactants. They will reproduce through asexual reproduction. So they use mitosis to reproduce. And then let's talk about the examples. So methanogens, they like to live where there's a lot of methane gas. If I took one of you and put you in a chamber full of methane gas, you would die. Usually you'll find methane gas in like deep sea vents, that type of area. And so they like to live there. No other organism can. Halophiles like salty environments. So this is maybe, what are they called? Where it's like inlets of the ocean and then the water evaporates, it gets super salty. Anyway, if I put one of you in like a very salty environment, the water in your body would diffuse out of your body. So you would get super dehydrated and die. And then the last example is thermoacidophile. So thermo means heat, acid. Heat and acid is very similar to a volcano. So again, if I dump you into hot lava from a volcano, you would die. However, all of these types of bacteria really love it, and that's actually their favorite and best type of environment for them. So for eubacteria, this is another kingdom for bacteria. However, this is a bacteria that probably evolved after archaea bacteria. So this is like your standard bacteria that you might think of if you ever think of bacteria, but their defining feature is basically the prokaryotic cell, so no cell organelles. Because they're a bacteria, they are prokaryotic. They can be either a heterotroph or an autotroph, depending on the bacteria itself. They will produce asexually and using binary fission, which is very similar to mitosis. And then some examples are Bacillus pneumoniae, which is the bacteria that causes a bacterial infection of the lungs, that's pneumonia, and Escherichia coli, also known as E. coli. So the fun thing about E. coli is that it actually lines our entire digestive tract. So from mouth to anus, you are covered in E. coli. Now, my E. coli is unique to me. Your E. coli is unique to you. And it will actually help us digest food and absorb nutrients from our food. And so it is very helpful for us. But the issue is because our E. colis are unique to ourselves, if we mix E. colis, it can make us really, really sick and give us some explosive diarrhea. So if you get food poisoning, some of the time or most of the time, it's actually ingesting E. coli that your body can't interact well with. Usually it's coming from someone else's E. coli, which essentially means that when you get food poisoning, you've ingested someone else's poop. So it's more common than you think that this happens. This actually happens on a daily basis. We exchange our E. colis. However, if you get the wrong type of E. coli or too much of a different E. coli, like I said, that's when you get the explosive diarrhea. All right, so next kingdom is the kingdom of Protista. And this is like the first type of eukaryotic cell that probably evolved. So their defining characteristic is that they don't really have a defining characteristic. It's sort of like a group for organisms that can't be categorized into another group for whatever reason. Excuse me. So they are small. They tend to be unicellular. There are a few that are multicellular. And like I said, there's no like defining characteristic for Protista, except that you might fall into two different categories of organisms. And so that's why you're in Protista. So like I said, these are eukaryotic cells. They all have cell organelles. Because this is such a diverse group of organisms, they can be heterotrophs or autotrophs. Most of them will reproduce asexually. Some of them will produce sexually. And let's talk about the examples. So this right here is a paramecium. The green in it is actually a chloroplast. It can photosynthesize. So we want to classify it like a plant. However, it also is unicellular and moves around. So we want to classify it as an animal as well, because animals can move around. So it's not quite a plant. It's not quite an animal. it's a protist. We have some giant kelp, which is what you see right here. It's kind of like seaweed. And again, it behaves kind of like a plant, but also not really. So we can't classify it as a plant. So it becomes a protist. And then the last example over here is the amoeba. So again, it's unicellular, but it can also move around. So we want to classify it as an animal, but we can't. So it's a protist. So that's the kingdom of Protista. It's kind of like the group of organisms that don't fit into other groups. All right, so next up we got the group of fungi, or the kingdom of fungi. One of my favorite science jokes, because it's kind of a dry subject, but a mushroom walks into a bar and the bartender's like, "Hey, we don't serve mushrooms here." And the mushroom's like, "Why not? I'm a fun guy." Hey, science humor. Okay, I'm moving on. So the defining characteristic of a fungi is that it is a decomposing organism, which means that it eats dead things. So once we die and we're buried 6 feet under the ground, a fungus will come along and help to decompose our body by eating our dead remains. A lot of them are going to be multicellular. There are a few that are unicellular. And a slight difference between fungi and plants, because they grow out of the ground sometimes, is that their cell wall, instead of being made out of cellulose like with plants, they're made out of a different carbohydrate called chitin or chitin. You can say it either way. Fungi are all eukaryotes. They have cell organelles. They're all heterotrophs because they're decomposers, so they eat dead things. And actually, within the same fungus, depending on the part of the life cycle it's in, it can reproduce sexually or asexually, which is interesting. Some great examples of this are mushrooms. So if you've ever put like mushrooms on your pizza or just eaten mushrooms in general, you're not actually eating a vegetable, you're eating a fungi, which is also fun to do. So these are like the edible mushrooms. These would be a poisonous mushroom, and then bread mold is another example of a fungi. Now, one of the really cool things with a fungi that we are starting to learn about is that when you see a mushroom spore like this growing out of the ground, this is actually not the entire fungus. This is just like one spore of the fungus. So really, the fungi lives underneath the ground in like this huge expansive network, and it can go on for miles. And so you can see a mushroom, like if you're going on a hike, if you walk by one mushroom while you're on your hike, and then like a mile later you walk by the same type of mushroom, but it's a different mushroom, it probably belongs to the same fungus. And the fungus can actually like communicate with itself from like one location to another location. So technically, it can track your movement through the forest as you're hiking. So the military is looking into this in terms of like bioengineering tracking systems, like how they can use fungi to help track the movement of either the enemy or our own military. Interesting stuff. All right, so next up we have, I thought there was another picture. We have the kingdom of plants, or plantae. And so the defining feature for plants is that they photosynthesize. So most of them are multicellular. There is one called a euglena that is unicellular, and sometimes, depending on the year, it's classified as a plant. Sometimes it's classified as a protist. So that's what I mean with the protists, where it's like we want to put them in a category, but we can't. Anyway, plants, we know they're eukaryotic. They have cell organelles. Because they photosynthesize, they are autotrophs. They make their own food. Depending on the plant and depending on where in the life cycle of the plant you are, plants can reproduce sexually or asexually. A lot of plants will actually have both female and male parts. And so they can reproduce sexually, but they're reproducing with itself, which is another weird thing that plants do. And I'm sure you know different examples of plants. You look outside, green things are plants. So like grass, trees, bushes, flowers, fruits and vegetables. You can have cacti, or like this is a crazy like Venus flytrap of a plant right here too. But you get the idea. I think you know what a plant is. And so the last kingdom is the kingdom of animals. Oh, sorry. Kingdom of animals. And this is the kingdom that you belong to. So we are all animals. And our defining feature is that we have differentiated tissues. So this is basically, we have like different organs. So our tissue that makes up our liver is different than the tissue that makes up our brain, which is different than the tissue that makes up our skin, etc. Now, we all know that you are a eukaryote, so animals are eukaryotic as well. We have cell organelles. We eat food, so we are heterotrophs. We reproduce sexually, which is a different discussion for a different time. And examples are humans, or we can have scorpions, frogs, octopi, penguins, turtles, jellyfish, or my cute little kitties, Isabel and Harvey. All right, so viruses. I know we talked about this in the last unit, but as a quick recap, sorry, I thought there was one more picture. Viruses are not actually living things because they cannot react to their environment. So we're talking about them, but they're not actually alive. They do have DNA or RNA, and they will have some sort of membrane, capsid, all of that stuff. Because they're not living, they are neither prokaryotic nor eukaryotic. They are neither a heterotroph or an autotroph. They can't reproduce asexually or sexually. They hijack our cells' machinery to make more viruses and then kill our cells in the process. And some examples are HIV, mono or mononucleosis. So this is known as the kissing disease. It's transferred through saliva, and it makes you really, really tired. There was SARS, which is another version of COVID. Of course, COVID-19, and then the influenza virus is your common flu. So quick recap of viruses. At this point, I am gonna be stopping this video right here. So please pause, make sure you're checking in with your vocab notebook and you're filling it out as we go. But when we come back, we will be talking about ecology, and so the interactions between all these different types of organisms.